Everyone wants to be influential, but very few people actually master this skill. And to help you become the most influential person in the room, I speak with Steve Martin. Steve is the author of Influence at Work and Messengers, and he's the closest collaborator of Robert Cialdini, the godfather of influence. We cover how you can become more influential without changing people's minds, because that's very hard to do, how you can build trust in the age of super-distrusters, and how you can become a messenger people actually want to listen to. So join this conversation with one of the experts in the world on influence at work, Steve Martin. Why is it important to have influence at work?
Because influence is pretty much everywhere. In fact, it's rare to see a job description, whether you're the CEO or you're just joining the organization, where the job description doesn't have the word influence or persuasion in some form or iteration in it. Of course, you don't have to take my word for it. I follow some surveys, principally those that are conducted by Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and LinkedIn. They ask Oliver at the beginning of the year, what's going to be the most important skill that you need in your business this year? And they've been running these surveys for 15, 16 years now. And as you can imagine, the ebbs and flows of the workplace and differences in what's important will mean that those skills change. But there's one skill that never ever falls out of the top three, and that's influence, persuasion, or effective communication. They call them different things. Yeah. And the latest data we have from 2024 is that it's the number one skill. It even beats agentic AI. So that's, I think, the reason why it's important.
Totally agree, of course. Can it be learned, though? Is influence something we have or have not, or is it something we can acquire by, for instance, developing certain skills?
I think that's a great question, because oftentimes we see people that seem to have been gifted this ability to influence and persuade, capture their attention, and they seem to have been gifted this from birth. It's almost like a God-given skill. And I think it's true that there are certain people that do have that capability, but that doesn't mean that the rest of us need to look on enviously and, believe that our opportunities to influence and persuade people are always going to fall on stony ground. There are rules to how successful influence and persuasion works, often hidden, under-noticed rules. And if there are rules, we can learn those rules and we can apply them as well. So I think, Oliver, my response to that question is yes, all of us can learn to be a little more influential, a little bit more persuasive, and importantly, to do so in a way that doesn't make us feel icky or requires us to kind of sell our soul to the devil. We can do it in perfectly moral, responsible, and ethical ways too.
What's the difference then between influence and manipulation?
Well, there's a good question. I think, for some people, they would actually talk about manipulation being kind of morally reprehensible in that instance. It's an unethical, immoral, not a particularly good approach to influence. But of course, manipulation can mean different things in different contexts. In social psychology, if we're running experiments, we will use the word manipulate to describe how we're changing one environment over the other. So there are kind of differences, but like most things in life, they're context dependent. I think the really interesting thing is the difference between influence and persuasion.
Okay.
Because a lot of people, and I include myself here, we use those words influence and persuasion interchangeably, when in fact they're very different things. Specifically, influence is about how we can have an impact on another person or a group or maybe a whole population of people by something that we do, a piece of information that we present to them, an incentive that we offer, some sort of appeal to them. Influence is impact on an individual or a group that occurs from the outside. In contrast, persuasion is something that happens internally. Persuasion is largely described as inner changes that we have in our own minds that kind of update us, change our identity, our sense of beliefs, these kind of things as well. And so in that context, it's entirely possible to influence someone's behavior and not change their mind at all.
That is so fascinating, because I would think that I have to change someone's mind in order to change their behavior. And you're saying that's actually not true. Those are separate.
They are separate. Sometimes we do it will be helpful to change people's minds, but it's not necessarily the starting point. It really depends on what your goal, Oliver, is in terms of the outcome you're actually looking for. And in fact, we find in study after study that, we can have a pretty good effect at changing people's behavior in the moment. Their minds don't change at all. Mm-hmm. And in some contexts, in our businesses and our workplaces and our personal lives as well, we may not necessarily want to or need to change people's minds. And let's be really clear, changing people's minds is really, really hard. Mm-hmm. And so I think oftentimes the mistake a lot of people make in believing that in order to get some sort of outcome, they need to change someone's mind first is that leads them down a particularly dangerous and often ineffective path.
Head against the wall,
Well,
right?
yeah, you're thinking, if I'm going to change your mind, I've got to convince you. I'm going to your opinion is wrong, mine is right, see my way. And in those instances, we'll often go into a situation with our goal being to win the argument, not necessarily to win the outcome.
Could you give an example from business or other walks of life that exemplifies this difference between persuasion and influence?
I can. Actually, this is a really important one, I think, and it's work that two of my colleagues, Eloise Copland and Olivia Patterson at Influence at Work, conducted a few years ago. They ran a series of programs looking to reduce animal trafficking, of all things. The pangolin is one of the most, I think, actually the most trafficked animal in the world. They are sold for their scales for Chinese medicine, and then their carcasses are sold to questionable restaurants as a kind of off-the-menu delicacy. And they were engaged with an NGO and a charity out in Southeast Asia to see whether or not we could change people's minds in terms of, this is not a good thing to do, to eat this endangered animal. And what they found was that they were pretty effective at reducing the consumption of pangolin illegal meat by conducting a series of, little influence and impact strategies. But even when they were able to change people's behavior in the kind of post-mediation surveys that we typically do in studies, people's beliefs about whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do didn't change at all in that instance. And so oftentimes it is possible to have impact and change people's behavior as a result of some sort of external, as I say, information, an incentive, some sort of emotional trigger that we pull. And that's pretty efficient.
Yeah, right. It's often other people are doing it, right? So when I think about the business context now, AI implementation, some people are very negative views of AI and think, it's going to be the end of the world, makes it all stupid, etc. Yet the future of the business probably depends on the company introducing AI in a meaningful way so it could stay competitive. For that, you have to take people on this journey. And what you're saying, that I find highly interesting, is that you probably don't have to change people's beliefs about the upsides and downsides of AI in order to get them to use certain tools. Maybe it's enough for them to give them a training or tell them that their peers are already using that.
Entirely possible. And it's really fascinating that you brought up the example of, the application and the use of AI. A study, I'm not entirely sure if it's actually been published yet, but it was posted on SSRN just a couple of days ago, which one of the co-authors includes Robert Cialdini, the world-leading expert it's a friend, a long-term friend. I trained under Bob 20 odd years ago. And the study looked at whether the AI is persuadable. If the AI is trained on how humans are influenced and persuaded, can we then persuade that AI, that machine, to behave in pretty much the same way, even when they have been coded not to? And the data shows, and the paper's interesting, it's worth Googling, it's called Call Me a Jerk, How to Sweet Talk the Machine. And the data is really quite clear here. The AI is as susceptible to these human principles of influence and persuasion to the same extent that a human is.
Wow, that's kind of mind-blowing. In a way, it's understandable to be trained on human data in a way, but you wouldn't think that a machine is persuadable.
Well, and you can start to think about the implications.
Yes.
Not just the positive ones. There are possibly some concerns there.
Absolutely. I would definitely check that out. Since you mentioned Robert Cialdini, who is probably the most famous behavioral scientist and psychologist in the world, who wrote Influence, which mega bestseller over decades, updated as well, so super relevant up to this date. What triggered your interest in the psychology of influence that you've dedicated your professional life to?
Well, I originally contacted Bob because I thought he would be able to help us on a consulting job. I was working in a big corporation at the time, and we needed some help to kind of understand influence and persuasion. Even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it was core to our role then as much as it is now. So I called him and, said, maybe you could help. Do you do advisory work? Do you do consulting work? We started having a conversation with him and his postdocs. And then the company I was working for got taken over, and I was kind of in a little bit of a limbo. And he mentioned that he was looking for people to join him at the university and train under him and take the research out of the laboratory, out of the psychology department and into the real world. And I think he probably saw in me an aptitude to do that. I've got my own position now at the business school at Columbia, but I'm a rather impatient theorist and academic. I'm much more interested in how can we make this work and apply it in practice in meaningful ways. And so that was the starting point. And that was, over 20 years ago. And I kind of thought, well, if it didn't quite work out, I'll probably go back to the big corporate world. And I never did. And it turned out to be a very lucky episode in my life. I ended up, Bob at the time perhaps wasn't as well known and as revered as he is now. And you're exactly right. He is to date now the most cited living psychologist in the world.
Yeah.
And in the field of influence and persuasion. And so I was lucky to get that opportunity to meet, to work with him. And, we're very dear friends and colleagues now as well. We've published together. We speak most weeks. It was a lucky moment for me.
Amazing. Yeah, I love his work on persuasion as well. And I think it's so relevant these days that often, especially due to, let's say, content being the new sales almost, that we want to be persuaded before we actually talk to someone. It's very hard to get people on sales calls these days or show them demos or selling in any capacity because there's so much noise, there's so many messages. What people want now, as you know better than I do, is that we want to make up our own mind and then reach out rather than being reached out by a company that wants to sell us something. And that's where this persuasion part through content in many cases is so valuable.
I think you're right about that in two ways, actually. One of the questions that I am often asked by businesses, whether they're CEOs, people working in organizations, governments, is how do I know if I'm influential? How do I know if people see me as
such a good question,
persuasive? And my answer typically is, you'll know if you have influence if more people come to you than vice versa.
So inbound versus outbound almost.
Yeah.
If you find your day cold messaging people in order to sell your services, you're probably not very influential.
And then you're in the domain of persuasion. Okay, if you're lucky enough to have credibility, a position, a status, some notoriety, that people come to you because of your best-selling books or your insights or whatever the case may be. That's clearly true influence. But your point about persuasion, I think, is a valid one as well. So this was back in 2016 that the book in the series of books that I'm part of the team of published, came up with this, at first, somewhat kind of outrageous idea that it's entirely possible to arrange for an individual or an audience of yours to be potentially receptive to your message before they've even heard it. And it sounds like some sort of mind-reading, mind-bending trick, but it's not, as you rightfully have pointed out. If people are kind of minded to be receptive to a certain type of message, we can think about that in our communications, it's got lots of applications in digital advertising, online advertising, for example. Even, it's surprising to me how many people that advertise, for example, online and in magazines don't really think about this. If you're a consumer and you're reading an article about the cost of living crisis online, probably doesn't make sense that the next ad you see is for a Rolex watch, right? You're thinking about, well, the cost of living and how tight, money and budgets are and everything. So a high-end wristwatch is probably not the right thing. And so often asking the question, if I'm going to deliver a message or place an ad online, what is the person that's going to see this What have they been reading in the moment before they see my ad? And is that optimal from a mindset perspective? Are they in the kind of frame of mind that is conducive to my message? And oftentimes they're not. So save your money, choose another time. Often influence and persuasion, successful influence and persuasion is a function of good timing, not just a good message.
And how the audience is primed, right?
Right.
Can you explain the difference between priming and framing?
Yeah, I can. So priming is essentially this idea that we induce a positive or somewhat helpful frame of mindset in someone that they are going to be more inclined to be receptive to our message. For example, there was some famous studies done a number of years ago, I think back in the 90s now, where they found that the music that was played in wine stores had an influence over the type of wine that people were likely to choose. So when French wine was played, the French wine sales, when French music was played, the sale of French wine would. Yeah. And then when they changed the music to German music, then sales of Riesling would rise in these instances.
Naturally.
And so what we've got here is essentially an environmental trigger of sorts. Largely sensual in this instance, so it could be a sound, a sight, a smell, that primes a certain frame of mind or mindset, and then a message that is conducive or in alignment with that arguably might be more inclined to be kind of receptive. Another example, in online sales, for example, one furniture store found that if they had clouds in the back of their landing page on their website, people searched for more features of furniture related to comfort and softness. But if there were coins in the background, they went straight to how much is this? So there's another example from an online.
It's very primal, right? Is it positive?
It's kind
negative,
of primal,
cheap, expensive, that sort of thing. And I think about the business presentation context, for instance, do I start by outlining a problem or a negative, the nightmare scenario, or do I talk about the bright horizons, the opportunities at the end of the rainbow, that sort of thing?
Indeed. And then depending on those kind of emotional reactions that you actually trigger, people do actually have a different perspective in terms of their decision making. So, when people are feeling angry or kind of, quite viscerally emotive about something, they think much quicker. They are interested in just winning. They don't pay attention so much to the detail. The opposite is true in kind of counter emotions. So that's the kind of priming element. Framing is more, I think, setting the right psychological contrast for the message you're about to present. For example, thinking about the order in which, we just talked about wines in a wine store, thinking about the order of wines on a wine list. If we put the cheapest at the top and the most expensive at the bottom, people choose a different wine than if we simply reverse the order. So in that instance, what we are doing is we are making a conscious decision about the way in which our options are actually framed. And this makes really good sense because, you mentioned a few moments ago that we're just like almost inundated with information and data from the moment we wake up in the morning to the moment we retire in the evening. And these are ways in which we can make efficient, quick shortcuts, because the idea that people calculate answers is, I think, a naive one. Humans aren't calculating machines. Humans are comparing machines.
Say more.
So I think it's not just let's give more evidence, let's give more data so that they can do the math in their head and see that I'm right. The way that we get through life is not to calculate the right response, but to compare amongst other things. So when we look at a list, the first thing we see creates a frame of reference for our evaluation of everything else. I have this saying that, if you want to appear tall in a bar, go out with short friends.
Yeah.
There's your comparison.
There's a comparison. Yeah. And you're absolutely right about the cheap and the expensive, and obviously in marketing and sales and, a lot of what we do in business, we take this implicitly or explicitly into account, but often more because we learned it this way without necessarily understanding the neurology and psychology behind it.
Well, let me be even more forthright than that even. I will go so far now as to say that if you're the sort of individual or organization that uses data and evidence to convince an audience, to sell an idea, to get people behind a project or a program, remember this: it's never the evidence by itself that does the influencing and the persuading. It's never the evidence by itself. It's what you compare that evidence to that does the persuading.
Right.
It's the comparison to, not the evidence itself. There's no evidence, forgive the irony here, to suggest that evidence alone is a good source of data and information. It might be in a law of court of law, where everything is probative, but otherwise, it's all about the comparison. It's all about the comparisons.
Yeah.
We are not calculating
It's
machines.
such an important insight. And before we present the evidence, we should obviously talk about, or we should ideally get past the emotional gatekeepers in our audience's minds, right?
Right, yeah. Increasingly we're seeing, and for those that are really interested in it, I can absolutely commend the work of Jennifer Lerner over at Harvard, who have had the good fortune to work with recently, in fact. And this idea that we are increasingly in our lives, Oliver, faced with hard to answer questions.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, particularly if you're the CEO, you're faced with questions about what's going to happen in the future. Now, none of us have looking glasses. None of us have that crystal ball. So we're largely, making a future bet on the available evidence that's with us. But notice something that we all do when we are faced with a hard to answer question. We answer an easier one that no one asked.
That is true.
We don't answer the question, what is the right thing to do here? Because we don't know what the right thing to do is. So we replace that question with, what feels like the right thing to do here?
Mm-hmm.
And in that context, our feelings become the predominant data.
Right. And then we rationalize it, presumably.
We rationalize it. We will rationalize it depending on clearly the outcome. If it works well and everything is great, then didn't we do a great job? If things didn't work so well, then it was probably something else that caused it.
Yeah. I mean, we started this conversation by thinking about how can we be more influential? And it's essentially everything we talked about so far, just understanding these points you were making, they help us become more influential.
Right.
I'm also curious to hear your thoughts about messaging and how we can make our messaging more effective. In the book, you have this sort of ACE acronym, which I quite like. So could you speak to that as well?
Yeah. So in the book, this is the latest book, the Economist book you're talking about here, right?
Yes.
We make the case that almost all successful influence and persuasion, whether it's a proposal, a project, a presentation, a request, a simple ask for compliance, they gain their success by being able to trigger or satisfy one of just three fundamental human motivations. The first being accuracy. People want to do the right thing. Not necessarily the perfect thing, but the thing that is the most accurate given the constraints and the limitations they have, and there's lots of, implications if we don't do the right thing. We might lose money, we might lose face, we might make a bad decision, these kind of things. So we are under pressure to make as quick and as efficient a decision as we possibly can, but in an accurate way. Mm-hmm. And in those instances, this is where these comparisons and, are other people doing this? That might be a good source of, if everyone else is doing it, it's not just me joining the crowd.
Right?
It's a good proxy for an accurate decision. If they're doing it and they're a similar decision to me, it's probably, that seems like probably an accurate thing to do. But sometimes we do things because it's the connected thing to do. We are all social creatures at the end of the day. And sometimes our decisions and our actions allow us to kind of satisfy that fundamental motivation of connection. If I do this, Oliver will spend more time with me. We will deepen our connection, our relationship. If I do this for a client, okay, it might not necessarily make me money today, but it keeps that connection and that relationship going. So perhaps I'm willing to pay the price of accuracy for that deeper connection that, will be helpful over the longer term. And in some instances, we just want to do things because it allows us to feel good about ourselves. Right. It allows to live up to our self-ascribed traits, our values, the commitments we've actually made. And so invariably, there's always this dynamic where when people are making decisions, when they're acting in certain ways, they're satisfying one or a combination of those fundamental motivations. And the job of the influencer, the communicator, is to figure out what might be the most salient one, and to also recognize that sometimes they conflict. Sometimes we want to be part of the crowd. At other times, we want to stand out from the crowd. In fact, in some instances, we want to be part of the crowd and stand out from the crowd at the same time. So it's complicated, but I think it's a kind of neat way to think about the fundamental human motivations that underpin most successful influence and persuasion strategies.
And as a messenger, I need to really understand this. So just for me to recap, accuracy is, this feels like the right thing to do in this situation. Connection is, this brings me closer to other humans, which I would like, because connection is a human desire. And ego is, this is good for me. And that way we end up with the acronym ACE: accuracy, connection, ego. Can you give an example of how we could bring this to life in a message, in a business context?
Well, actually, there's a business that has been built these last 15 years that has done a pretty good job of actually fundamentally satisfying all three of those fundamental motivations of accuracy, connection, and ego. And it's Uber. In the past, when we needed a taxi, we would not be sure of how long we'd be standing outside in the rain, waiting for it. Now it's on our app. We see a nice little picture of a car. It tells us exactly when it's going to be arriving. It even tells us how much the ride is going to cost, and we can decide from the outset. So there's accuracy taken care of. There's connection there as well, because one of the things that Uber does is it connects you to the driver. It gives you information about the driver. It tells you information about what other people have said about this driver, so you can feel like it's the connected thing to do as well. And I realize that this is a little bit of a stretch, but even the ego motivation is actually taken care of. And I'm not just talking about the number of points or stars or your rating that drivers give to you. I mean, that could make you feel good about yourself or not so good. But if you time your exit from the pub at just the right amount of time as the car is pulling up, who knows, you might even be able to kind of feel like a little bit of an A-lister for a moment or two as well. So there's an example of a business that has actually built its whole model around these fundamental motivations.
Absolutely. And Airbnb and many others come to mind, right? Similar approach. So I can totally see this. This is very helpful. And if you, I guess the more of these three you can cover, the more persuasive your messaging will become.
Potentially.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about the influence equation?
Yes. Now, somewhat different, and it requires a little bit of an explanation, because a few years ago I was approached by The Economist to write this book, and I really didn't want to write it. Okay. And there's a couple of reasons why I didn't want to write it. The first is that, and you've written a few books yourself, Oliver, it's not an enjoyable experience.
It's bloody hard.
It's really hard. It's really hard. And, I see posts on, online media, LinkedIn, and this people that go, I've just decided to write my first book. I'm so excited. And I feel very excited and sorry for them in equal measure, because I'm thinking, right, well, that's about the most it's ever going to be in terms of rewarding until you've finished it. Who was it that said, I enjoy having written a book?
All writers.
All writers, I think,
Whereas musicians say, I love to play, but writers like to have written, for sure.
This is it. And so, I'd already written with Cialdini and Noah and the like in the past. So and Joe too. So I'd no desires to write this book. And the second reason was that I didn't really know if I had anything to write about. Influence had been published first back in 1984. We had its 40th anniversary last year. And then, the collection of us, we wrote Yes. It wasn't really the follow-up. It was more a practical guide to influence, but it was seen as the follow-up to the Influence book. And that got published in 2008. And then we did The Small Big. And then we did Messengers back in 2020. I didn't really feel like I had anything else to say about influence. But then I kind of thought about it. And I'm kind of thinking, it is The Economist, right? And why would I want to say no to The Economist? And so I started to think about, well, typically the work that we have been doing in the psychology of influence and persuasion is been all about how do you effectively communicate your message, connect with people, convince people to act, beyond the economics and the evidence. So, assuming you have a good case to make and the economics make sense, how do you differentiate your case based on the social aspects of influence? That's been our work to date. And so I kind of figured, is there a way of kind of broadening that out a bit? And I came up with this idea that successful influence, if you want to be a good communicator, a good persuader, it can be really helpful to think about successful influence and persuasion in the same way that an artist thinks about color.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I guess a lot of us will remember back to art class at school where we found out that we could mix various combinations and quantities of the three primary colors of red, yellow, and blue, and we could make myriad other colors, okay, from those three basic ingredients. And I believe to a certain extent, the same is true when it comes to successful influence, persuasion, communication, and change. All of us can create a compelling case based on the right combination of evidence, economics, and emotion. Or put another way, when we think about influence and persuasion, think about what is the right percentage or proportion of facts, finances, and feelings that we put into our case. And that proportion will be dependent on the context of our case. So that gives us our equation. So influence essentially is, or successful influence is a function of the right amount of evidence, economics, and emotion. And that proportion is dependent on the context you find yourself in. The one thing I can absolutely say with some confidence now, having been writing about this for the last few years, is that those proportions are never the same. It's never 33, 33, 33 in the 30s. And there's something quite nice about the primary color metaphor. I don't know what color, do you know what color you get if you mix equal quantities of red, yellow, and blue?
Purple?
No, you get a really kind of dark, shitty brown color.
Oh, okay.
Which is beautiful, really, because that's not influence at all either. So that's essentially
metaphor.
That's essentially the influence equation. And then what we talk about then is when it comes to presenting evidence, when it comes to making a case purely on economics, or when it comes to an emotional case, what are the three most important things that you should always do? Not are the 50 things that you could do, but what are the three things that are always going to be the most important when you are trying to persuade people using evidence or economics or emotions, and then that helps you build your case?
And just to clarify, evidence and economics, how are they different? Because you could argue that, economics should be based on evidence.
Yeah, I think what I'm talking about here is primarily financial incentives.
Got it.
I can inform you into change. I can kind of like convince you through an emotional story. I could just say, Oliver, I want you to do this. I'm going to pay you.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. Understood. Amazing. So that's very helpful because these three ingredients are usually part of messaging, and it depends on the audience and the context, I presume, which one I want to focus on. So if I speak at The Economist economics conference, I may want to focus a bit more on the evidence economic side. If I speak at the tech conference, I'll probably focus more on the emotional side, because even if there's sort of similar people in the audience, the context is different, the expectations are different. So I need to be quite mindful. And what I always do is ask myself, what do I want the audience to know, feel, and do? Not just to know, because that's the easy part, but also to feel and to do. And that usually helps me to, as a compass when I think about persuasion.
That makes good sense to me,
Yeah. How important is the messenger? And the reason I'm asking is obviously, for a long time, it has been said, based on a famous book from the 1960s, the medium is the message. You wrote a book, co-authored
Marshall
a book.
McLuhan, yeah, of course, the Canadian.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So medium is the message. That was the big thing for decades. You came out 5 years ago with your co-author, Joseph Mark, saying, no, actually, it's the messengers. And I tend to agree with you, but I'd love to hear from you why you think that the messenger is now the most important factor when it comes to getting the message across.
Well, I think there's a whole array of reasons that, it's easy to look in the rearview mirror and explain after something's happened why it's actually happened and why we are where we are in the world today. But let me see if I can pull a couple of points together to make this point. So the first is that we see it every single day. Okay, I don't need to present evidence or data. All of us, not just the people that are listening to this cast today, but all of us in everyday life, see this phenomena playing out.
Mm-hmm.
We are in the most stimulus-saturated, information-overloaded environment that has ever existed, and it gets worse tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day.
Absolutely.
We cannot possibly have the cognitive bandwidth, the time, the energy, the resources, the motivation to listen to everything that's being said and to make a decision about, is this the right decision? Is this the right thing to do, the wrong thing? And so one of the things that we have noticed, and it's always been there, it's just it seems to have been amplified, particularly in recent years, Oliver, is that rather than asking, what should I decide here? People are instead saying, who shall I listen to here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. And as a result, the messenger becomes the message in that context. Now, it's always been there, okay? It's always been there. If, we have a challenge with our health, we go see a doctor. There's a good messenger. If we've got a challenge with our car, we go see a mechanic. We've typically thought about these people that we rely on and listen to them because of who they are, not necessarily because of what they say, because they have what psychologists call instrumental value. And that's how a good society should actually operate, right? That's the reason why we have plumbers and doctors, and we have technicians, and we have nurses, and we have, builders, and we have, computer scientists. We can't all be expert at these kind of things. But what's actually happened as knowledge and information has become democratized, and we have increasingly found ourselves in a situation where we don't know who to pay attention to now because we don't know whether something is true or not.
Right.
The message has almost become an irrelevance in this instance, and it is now the messenger. We're not being asked to decide anymore. We're being asked to choose a side. And the manifestation of that now and where we are is the fact that, we have people that will hawk false facts online. We have politicians that will lie, and we trust them more often as a result of that because we're choosing a side. And so we started to see this back in 2016, 2017, and Joe and I, Joe was working with me at the time, Dr. Joe now, Dr. Joe Martz, of course, he's now finished his PhD and the like. We started to ask ourselves the question, well, what are the reliable factors that incline people to listen to certain messages, regardless of the truth or wisdom of what they're saying? And that's what spawned the book, Messengers, who we listen to, who we don't, and why. And we explored that, and we explored the types of messengers in today's society that are more likely to be listened to or less likely to be listened to on the basis of who they are, not on the basis of what they say.
So fascinating. And obviously a lot has changed since the book came out 5 years ago, in particular AI.
Yep.
And I totally agree. The trend has been going for at least 10 years, or if not more. Today, when you think about elections in recent years, doesn't matter which country you look at, we look at podcasts. Why a podcast is so influential is because people decide that they are messengers they trust. They tend to go back to the same podcast. It almost doesn't really matter what the topic of the day is or who they talk to. They just like the show. They like the messenger and the other messengers they invite. And now that we see more deepfakes, more AI-generated content, makes it very hard to discern what's actually true and what's false. So in a way, for our own mental sanity, we choose these shortcuts and say, I trust A, B, and C messengers, and I will trust that they curate the world for me and help me make sense of a very complex, very confusing world. And therefore, I look towards messengers rather than messages or the medium, essentially.
I think you're right about that. There's another point I would add, specifically about the audio podcast.
Yeah.
It has a feature that I think is particularly persuasive, which is that it's the most intimate of communication channels.
Right.
When you're listening to a podcast, you'll typically listen to your podcast with your headphones or your earbuds, the noise abatement system that it has on it as well. So it feels like they're only talking to you. It's the most personal, the most intimate.
Yes.
And that has an impact as well. There's a broader implication, of course, to this and where we've gotten to, and this is where the focus of pretty much most of the day job is for me now, is that we have spawned a new type of consumer, a new type of citizen in the world. They're growing in number. There's a significant number of them. Typically, psychologists will look at individuals and look at how they trust others on a basis of, are they high trust people or are they low trust people? High trust people are the kind of people that are willing to listen and trust and give everyone an opportunity. Low trust people tend to be the kind of people that think, well, you prove to me that you're trustworthy, and then once you've done that, then I'll start to trust you and we can start to engage. There's a new group now that we are finding significant and compelling evidence for, and they're a growing population. These are people, they're not high trust, they're not low trust. Their starting point, Oliver, is to distrust everyone and everything.
Whoa.
And the implications for this are crazy. Because
It is.
trust is the social contract in a society that keeps us.
Yeah.
And there's very many reasons, I think, that this group of, we call them the rise of the super-distrusters. By the way, this is not a UK thing. It's not a German thing. It's a westernized and individualized cultural thing. So we'll see it in the US, we'll see it in Germany, we'll see it in Ireland, we'll see it, these kind of ways. We think we're seeing it in Southeast Asia. It's just that people don't talk about it that much because of the cultural consequences of actually doing that. But if we are now in a situation where a significant proportion, and in the UK, our data is it's close to 3 in 10 working adults, whose default is to distrust everything, that's problematic, particularly for business, because in low trust societies, what typically happens is governments tend to overreach and they start to put more regulations in place. It makes business harder to get. It takes longer to sign things. If there's more regulation, that just stifles innovation. It stifles technological advancements, these kind of things. It's bad for everyone concerned.
Lots of friction in everyday life, in business life, across the board.
Indeed.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting about these super-distrusters is they defy every lazy stereotype. So they're not like middle-aged men who've voted for Brexit and that are right-wing and that don't have college degrees. They're more likely to be Zoomers than they are Boomers. They're younger, they're educated, they're mobile, they're smart.
Wow.
And they're pretty angry in life as well, because a lot of the things they've been promised these last 10, 15 years haven't come true. And, there's a case to be made that they probably have a right to feel the way that they actually do. But that's the group I'm watching now, and how we reconnect and influence and engage with them, because they are a significant part of our society now. So that's the implication of technology and the democratization of not just facts, but falsehoods as well. And the implications it's actually having on kind of social contracts and trust. It's fascinating. And I think if there's one message that I'm giving out to kind of businesses and institutions and governments at this moment in time, is you need to pay attention to this group, and you need to start thinking about how you essentially align and, come up with strategies for managing, dealing, engaging with them. They are not a problem to be fixed. They are a group that needs a good listening to and a good sense of understanding. And so our basic tenets of influence and persuasion are going to be really important tools there.
Right. And do you think they could then change their position and come around and become, at least medium, mid-level trusting? Is that, or are they gone? Are they just, that's the mindset forever?
No, I don't think it's the mindset forever, but I do think that there's a piece of a compromise here that needs to take place. These aren't, crazy conspiracy theorists. They're smart people. They, I know some super distrusters. They have PhDs. Okay. They're clever. They're smart people. They're not wrong. They're disenfranchised. They've become disillusioned. They've, been sold the story of, improve your life, go to college, do these things, you'll earn more than everyone else. And it's not worked out for them. COVID was a disaster for them. The financial crisis was a disaster for them. And they're looking for meaning, for, why are the things that I have worked so hard for and that I have promised not coming true? And, when they compare to their previous generations, their parents, their grandparents, it's a very, very different story. So they become disillusioned, but they they represent 30% of our populations in westernized individual countries. So they can basically, they can shape elections. They can shape new governments.
Shape elections. Absolutely. They can be. Oh, wow. That's so important. And would you say in your book, you make the distinction between hard messages or, soft and hard, essentially.
Yeah.
One more essentially from a position of authority, one more from a position of influence. What's the more effective messenger in this day and age?
Well, I don't think there's necessarily a certain messenger that's going to be effective all the time. In the same way as I will start any, whether I'm teaching at the university, whether I'm giving a talk at a kind of conference for leaders, salespeople, it doesn't really matter. I will always start out by saying, if you've come here to learn the thing that is going to get you to persuade 100% of the people 100% of the time, you're in the wrong place. It just doesn't exist. And anyone that claims that they do have that secret, you just need to kick them out the room. So it's not the case that there's going to be a certain type of messenger that is always going to be most effective. But I think it's helpful to think about messengers in those hard and soft terms. So briefly, in some instances, hard messengers, and a hard messenger essentially is defined as a communicator who is seen by their audience to have some status over that audience. Mm-hmm. They're richer or more famous than they are. They've got, elevated expertise. Maybe they're more attractive. Or in some instances, they're just dispositionally more dominant.
Yeah.
And in some instances, they don't sound necessarily a particularly compelling lot, but people do seek them out in certain instances. Whereas in other instances, people are more inclined to be persuaded by the softer message. And the softer messenger is someone who's defined as they don't have status over their audience. They have a connection with their audience. They're seen as warm, trustworthy, vulnerable, or in some instances, charismatic. Mm-hmm. So they create connections. Now, what is important here is the circumstances in which we find ourselves in. So typically what we find is that if audiences are uncertain, they are anxious, they are worried, they're concerned about things, they have a tendency to listen more and follow the advice of the harder, status-driven messenger. Now, there's probably a few of your listeners now that are thinking, oh, hello, this suddenly makes quite a lot of sense,
mm-hmm.
and explains in some degree the rise of the hard, dominant leader and politician. Because their strategy often will be to create that distrust and that anxiety so that their dispositionally dominant personality is the place to go. They are creating the environment for their dominant messenger status to exist. They are persuading.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And there's method to the madness, right? There is madness for the untrained eye. To us, looks like, okay, there's absolutely a strategy behind this.
And it turns out that it's not just a political or a societal thing. It's a corporate thing as well. There's good data that show that when, a business is looking to replace a leader, particularly a high-ranking leader, say on the X committee and executive committee, a CEO, chief financial officer, whatever it may be. If that business is currently not doing very well, if it's lost its way, if its strategy is failing, if its share price is low, boards will typically recruit a much more dominant, hard, orientated messenger in those instances. But if things are going well, the strategy is going well, the share price is going well, there's high degrees of psychological safety, that same board will in those instances promote or appoint a much softer messenger in that instance. So it's very easy sometimes, I think, to commentate what's actually happening in the world, but these same principles are actually happening in our businesses too.
That is true. That is true. Steve, I could talk to you for hours. Hopefully we get to do part 2 at some point. And I want to bring this home to land and ask you, and there's always my final question, what's your best piece of communications advice?
Be more human.
Be more human in the age of AI.
Indeed.
Say more.
Well, I think one of the things that we maybe have lost sight of is the fact that influence, persuasion, communication, relationships, convincing others is primarily a human affair. And we've got all these tools, these new ways of working, these apps, these robots, these agentic AIs and all these kind of things that seem to be doing a lot of things that, allow us to be a little bit more efficient, allow us arguably to free up time. I'm not sure they do that at all. I've never been busier. At the expense of our humanity. At the end of our program at Columbia, I've got a couple of brilliant colleagues in Stefan Meyer and Oded Netzer, who run the behavioral science program at Columbia with me at the business school. And we do this round kind of table panel thing at the end, and we get various people in to kind of talk. And invariably the question that comes up is an AI going to steal my job?
Mm-hmm. That's the big question.
And one of the ways we respond to that is to ask people to consider their hands at the end of the day. If you have to wash your hands at the end of the day, you're probably going to be okay, because robots are good at making things. They're not especially good, at least not yet, at repairing things. So that's the first thing. Here's the other one. Count how many times your hand has shaken someone else's hand. Because a robot can't do that.
Right.
So that is the essence behind if there's one thing to leave you with today, it's be more human.
Amen to that. I'm so in agreement with you. As I said, supercomputers need super communicators, and you help us be and become super communicators. Steve, I so appreciate everything you've shared with us today, all the work you're doing. Please check out the books, Messages, and now Influence at Works. Highly recommended. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Likewise.